Hello, everyone. We'll give people a couple minutes to let people trickle in. So we will begin. Hello, everyone. Thank you so much for joining us this evening for the OCIC Youth Policymakers Hub's Policy Matters series. My name is Kezia Odro, and I'm a current YPH member. I'm currently a social finance consultant in the SOGS sector here in Ottawa, also known as the unceded, unsurrendered territory of the Algonquin and Anishinaabe people. And I'm super excited to dive into the future development of financial inclusion. This session comes at the intersections of policy, economic growth, and international cooperation. To give a brief overview about us, OCIC's Youth Policy Makers Hub, YPH for short, is a diverse group of 25 youth members from Ontario, aged 20 to 25 to 35 years old, seeking to engage in international cooperation, policy processes, and support of gender equality. We also focus in on Canada's Feminist International Assistance Policy, the action areas, as well as UN Sustainable Development Goals. You can find more about us on OCI's website, and the link is now in the chat. This year, we are focusing our flagship program for the YPH, the Policy Matters series, on the Feminist International Assistance Policy. With a monthly focus on each of its action areas, for today's session, we will focus on Area 3, Growth That Matters. We are thrilled to have two guests from the Women, Peace and Security Network of Canada on our panel for today. Ian Thomson, the Manager of Policy from Oxfam Canada, as well as Rosa Hageraats, Gender Specialist at CDF Canada. So a bit of housekeeping before we begin today's session. Firstly, today's session will be recorded for note-taking and will be disseminated on OCIC's social media platforms for reporting purposes. Secondly, to keep in touch with us, follow us on social media. OCIC is on Twitter, Instagram, LinkedIn, and Facebook, all of which are being shared in the chat by Leanne. Lastly, OCIC is committed to creating a safe and inclusive space. We ask that all of you commit to our code of conduct, which is inspired by the Intercouncil Network of Canada, as well as Amnesty Canada. This code of conduct is now being shared in the chat. It outlines our shared commitments towards respect, inclusion, humility, safety, solidarity, patience, and openness for all participants and collaborators. If you see or experience anything in conflict with this code of conduct, please do not engage directly, contact an organizer, and we will respond appropriately. I would like to now pass it to Ray to give a land acknowledgement. Thank you.
Hi, everyone. In beginning a land acknowledgement, I want to depart from the harmful convention of robotically reciting a prepared statement. The intention behind land acknowledgements was not meant to be an agenda item to tick off. It's actually intended to build mindfulness and intention when we're hosting a gathering. And it's really a call for all of us to reflect upon the relationship that we each have with the land and a call to action to understand the histories that have brought us here. And land acknowledgements do not exist in a past tense, as colonialism is a current ongoing process. So OCIC recognizes and honors the Indigenous peoples who have historically lived on these lands and do so presently. These are lands that are traditional, both treaty and unceded territories that OCIC operates on. These include the Huron, the Wendat, the Petun First Nations, the Seneca, the Haudenosaunee, the Anishinaabe, the Mississaugas of the Credit River First Nations, as well as many others. OCIC staff, directors, volunteers, and members engage and operate on the unceded territories of these and numerous other Indigenous peoples and nations. As we each reflect on our roles within our settler colonial context, we acknowledge the importance of naming the Indigenous peoples and nations on whose lands we live, work, and play, and understand the importance of framing our engagement in the international cooperation sector and beyond through reconciliation and decolonization. We recognize that we have a responsibility to stand in solidarity with Indigenous peoples who have and who continue to fight for social justice on their own lands. So acknowledgement is only the first step. We all must move beyond acknowledgement to action, not only in our discussions tonight, but also every day. So I'd now like to pass things off to my colleague, Raja.
Great, thank you so much, Ray. Tonight we'll be moving on to the activity portion, and I will be putting a link to the Jamboard as well as I will be sharing my screen. You folks can feel free to hop on that Jamboard. Give me a quick thumbs up when you have hopped on, just so I know and we can start. But I'm going to also screen share as well. Okay. Can everyone see my screen? Okay, perfect. So, great. So today's activity, sorry. Thank you. So today's activity portion will be focused on Canada's Feminist International Assistance Policy with a focus on the growth area 3, growth that works for everyone. And we'll be going through a couple of activities today, but yeah. So our first activity is a word association activity, and this is basically we'll be given you all will be given a list of words, and there'll be sticky notes on the side. I would like you all to share the first word that comes to mind when you think about the key terms. Keep your responses brief and spontaneous. They could be little phrases, or they could be a single word that you think of when you think about this specific word, and be creative and have fun. So these are the 5 words, and I have sticky notes on the side. You can feel free to write on those sticky notes, or maybe pop out a new sticky note from the left-hand side. But let's start with inclusive growth. So what are some phrases or key terms or anything that comes to mind when we think about the word inclusive growth? And you guys can just use those sticky notes right there. Okay, wait for some responses. Yeah, so all you have to do is click on if anybody's unsure, all you have to do is click on the sticky note. Great, so we have a couple: equity, decolonial practices, formative, performative. Let's see if there's more. Okay, great. Like, getting our brains thinking a little bit before we dive in deeper. But yeah, what about glass ceiling? Oh, some good ones here. Recognizing the informal economy, diversity, equity, inclusion. Great. And let's move on to glass ceiling now. What are some words, phrases, anything that come to mind when thinking about the glass ceiling? Patriarchy, yeah. Inequality. Record profits are unpaid wages. Trailblazing, it's a good one. And what about the gender pay gap? Challenging institutions, which is actually a great point when we talk about like the gender pay gap, because these are norms that exist, but it's always about challenging the normative theory, right? Leadership. What about financial inclusion? This is kind of a special one. Unrestricted funding. Systematic. Harmful. Discrimination. Capacity building. I love that one. Whoever put that one up there. Understanding different financial needs. And I mean, I think you bring up a great point there. People do need or have or come from different backgrounds where they do require different financial needs. And I think accessibility and inclusivity is all about addressing those different financial needs. And we can go to our last one, which is unpaid work. And I'm seeing some harmful there, which I agree with as well. Harmful. Burden. Privilege. Good. Needs to be recognized. Yes. Great. Okay. These are some amazing points. Thank you all so much for, delving deep into these keywords and getting, your brains working a little bit. But let's go move on to our next activity. Amazing, amazing points, everyone. I got that last one, caregiving. Okay. So our next activity is, what are some barriers that women face, what are some barriers to women's participation in the labor force? So there are key words or phrases that you have to drag to the wall, and these phrases are the ones that you think are barriers to women's participation in the labor force. So I'll give you guys a couple of minutes to Shafana.
Oh, sorry, I just had a quick question. What did you mean by state regulation? I was just confused on that.
Sorry, state regulation?
Yeah.
Oh, I don't, could you maybe tell me when I don't remember.
Oh, I'm just referring to the current activity we're doing, and one of the barriers states that it's state regulation. So I was just confused on what exactly that meant.
It refers to different policies and regulations that inhibits women to participate in labor force. For example, there are policies that are requiring like certain gender discrimination towards women in a certain labor industry, for example.
All right, thank you.
Thanks, Leanne. Okay, so we have some barriers. So actually the knack of this activity was that all of the items were actually barriers. So they were all barriers. So you guys essentially got that right. We wanted to like make it a little twist, but yes, unpaid domestic work, gender discrimination, workplace harassment, these are all barriers to women's participation in the labor force. And some may be a surprise or some may be already known. So just to get you all thinking again, on a broad or on a general spectrum, why do you guys think, or why do employed women earn less than men? And these can be, you know, a popcorn idea, whatever comes to mind. I mean, it could be broad, it could be very specific, but just some general ideas. Career gap from childbearing and parenting. And I think that first one is a really great one because there is when women have to leave for a maternity leave, it's I've actually, my mom has experienced this when she had to leave for a maternity leave. It was never the same when she came back, and so that played a big part and she works, so that played a big part. Historical patriarchy, women concentrated in low-paying jobs. Yeah. Also, women, you know, I obviously, like, I think we mentioned this before, but the glass ceiling, when women are just put in a system where they are made to be less, or made to be in areas of work that are less. Historical patriarchy, prevention of career progression. And I think this is it, like when we're talking about climbing the corporate ladder, what are some barriers why women can't, you know, climb that corporate ladder? Gender wage discrimination, gendered caregiving roles, responsibility taking care of children, helping relative, motherhood penalty. Yeah, these are all amazing points. Some that I can relate to as well, that my mom can actually relate to as well. You know, bringing us up, and so these are some really great points. And status quo, yeah, like challenging the norm, challenging status quo. So thank you guys so much. And let's take this last one. Assumptions that'll go on to maternity leading to degradation for promotions. Thank you all so much for this. Yeah. Okay, so here's a little fun question. But according to Statistics Canada, how much do women earn for every dollar men earn? Drag the icon. So I'll be dragging that icon, but if you guys can just put in the chat, there are 3 options here: 0.50, 0.70, 0.90. If you could all, I don't know if I can see the chat here, but if you maybe you guys could quickly say the answer, and then we all collectively think what the answer is, and then we'll share that. And the second question was, according to Statistics Canada, how much do women from different groups earn for every dollar men earn? Drag the amount that corresponds to the group. So there are 3 groups. There is Indigenous women, there's racialized women, and newcomer women, and then we have 3 options: 71 cents, 65 cents, and 67 cents. So let me just look at the chat really quick. Okay, so we have 0.90. Also, could you guys let me know for just for what question? So 0.90, 0.7. So I think I'm pretty sure that's for the first question. Okay. Well, what about the second question? What do we think for the different groups? Give everyone a second for that one. For women, 0.65. Okay, well, let's see if your guys' answers are correct or if some of you were close. So actually, according to Statistics Canada 2022, women earn, the amount that women earn for every dollar men earn is 0.90. And according to Statistics Canada, women from different groups earn for every dollar men earn. So Indigenous women, it's 65 cents. And I think someone in the chat wrote newcomer woman was 65 cents. So it's actually Indigenous woman is 65 cents, racialized woman is 67 cents, and newcomer woman is 71 cents. Okay, so here's a little myth or fact type question. So the Feminist International Assistance Policy is only relevant to developed countries. It doesn't apply to developing nations. Is this a myth or is this a fact? Myth. So we got Siobhan saying myth. Myth. Leanne is saying fact. It's a myth. Okay, so it looks like we got a couple of myths here, one fact. So let's actually see. So it actually is a fact. The policy applies to both developed and developing countries, recognizing that gender inequality and the need for inclusive growth are global issues. So that one was a fact. Alrighty, let's move on to our next one here. The Feminist International Assistance Policy is a one-size-fits-all approach. Myth or fact? Myth. Got a couple of myths. Okay, so it seems like we are we have a lot of myths up over here. That's actually a fact. The policy encourages flexibility and recognizes that each context may require unique approaches to achieving gender equality and inclusive growth. The Feminist International Assistance Policy is only about women's issues. Is that myth or fact? It's that last one here. Myth. Okay, a couple of myths. While the policy has a strong focus on gender equality and women's empowerment, it also addresses broader issues of inclusivity and social justice. Okay. All right. This is our last, I think it's our last one. This is our activity for key performance indicators of action area 3. So the FIAP invests in better data collection and evaluation for gender equality. Vast performance indicators were developed to track performance of Canada's international assistance programming. These are the two key performance indicators, KPIs, for action area 3. So on the left, there's an orange box, and these are the two key performance indicators, and we have our SDG indicators. So what I would like you all to do is drag the X to the SDG indicator that is related to the KPI. So just drag the X to any SDG indicator that you think is directly correlated to the KPI on the left. And I can read that KPI for you guys. Number of people reached by projects that support women's economic empowerment, number of entrepreneurs, formers, and smallholders provided with financial and or business development services. So you can just drag, or if you want me to drag it, but anyone is welcome to. Yeah, got one. Proportion of small scale industries. Okay. All right. So it seems like we used up all of our X's on each SDG indicator, and you all are actually all correct. So each SDG indicator, all of them were actually directly correlated to the KPI for action area 3. Good work. Alrighty, so according to 2020-2021 International Assistance Report, what are the top 5 recipients for job opportunities and economic growth? So what we're going to be doing here is sorting the letters into the correct country name. So each row has a country, and you guys could just sort out the letters to match the correct country. I think for this one to work, maybe each person can tackle one row, because if everyone is going into, each row, it'll get messy. But try to pick one and see if you can guess the country. And you can just directly go and just sort the letters. Okay, yeah. Oh, okay. Bangladesh for the first one. Yeah. So we got Ghana, Kenya, Senegal, Ethiopia. Alrighty, I think I don't want to give it away, but I think most of you guys have guessed the answer. So we can just go ahead and look at the answers. So yes, Bangladesh for the first one. We had Ethiopia. Bangladesh was 58.4 million, Ethiopia with 53.6 million, Ghana with 37.5 million, Kenya 29 million, and Senegal 25.8 million. Yeah, good job to everyone who guessed those correctly. And that is the end of our activity. I am going to stop screen sharing now. Oof. Perfect. And I will pass it on to Leanne.
Everyone, and now I'm going to be introducing our speakers for today's Policy Matter session. So without further ado, let's first welcome our first speaker, Ian Thomson, and he will be spotlighted. Ian Thomson is the Manager of Policy at Oxfam Canada. In his role, Ian leads the organization's work on government relations, corporate engagement, and feminist policy influencing Canada and the international stage. Before joining Oxfam Canada, he coordinated the Human Rights and Natural Resources Program of the National Economical Coalition. His extensive background also includes leadership within the Canadian Network of Corporate Accountability and contributing as a board member of the Makila Solidarity Network. With his academic roots in engineering from Queen's University and University of Toronto, Ian brings a unique perspective to the advocacy work. Also joining us, I am very excited to also welcome Rosa Hageraats, who works as a gender specialist with the Co-operative Development Foundation of Canada, also known as CPF. As part of the program's team, she is responsible for integrating gender mainstreaming practices into CDF cooperative development approaches and international practices. Her rich background has taken her across Latin America and West Africa, working alongside women-led organizations to propel women's empowerment processes, supported by the Government of Canada for the past 6 years. And now to facilitate the upcoming discussion and manage our dialogue, I'm pleased to pass the virtual mic to our moderator, Sanya. Sanya will guide us through the next segment of our session, which will be engaging Q&A with our speakers. Sanya, over to you.
Perfect. Thank you, Leanne. And thank you, Ian and Rosa, for joining us today. We really appreciate your time in coming to speak with us. So the first question is sort of general and it's addressed to both of you, but we're just asking if you can discuss the need to focus on Action Area 3 of the Feminist International Assistance Policy, specifically why it's so important to stress on this area. So I guess I'll point to Ian first.
Great, thanks, Sanya. Happy to kick it off. Can you hear me okay? Super. Yeah, I'm really happy to be here today. I'm joining you from the unceded territory of the Anishinaabe Algonquin people in the Ottawa area. So thanks so much for inviting Oxfam Canada. It's a real privilege to be here, and we love OCIC and all the work that you do. So I'm really happy to be joining tonight. On why inclusive growth is so important, I think the opening activities that we just engaged in are really a clear indicator of why it's so crucial. So thank you for having some of those activities to kick off the session today. We still find that gender is one of the #1 predictors of who is poor and who isn't poor in this world. And as long as that's the case, we really have to make gender equality central to fighting poverty. We're never going to end poverty until we end the patriarchy and really realize gender equality. And that's really why we, it should be at the center of our work in our sector, but also it should be a major priority for the Canadian government in how it approaches international cooperation work. So as long as that's the case, we have to continue to close those gender wage gaps that you were talking about a moment ago. We have to look at who holds power in the global economy. We find time and time again, women and girls are systematically disempowered in the global economy. Their work is undervalued. They face barriers to economic participation and political participation. And as long as that's the case, we really have to make economic inclusion and economic equality an important part of our work. And I think that's also why it ended up as one of the central pillars of the Feminist International Assistance Policy. That if we're not dealing with economic justice issues, we're never going to achieve gender equality. So maybe I'll leave it there and turn it over to Rosa.
Okay, great. Well, thanks, Ian, and thank you, Sonia, for the question. I'm also really excited to be here today. So thank you for having me, and thank you to the OCI Youth Policymakers Hub. Thank you as well for starting off by grounding us in acknowledgement of the traditional treaty and unceded territories that we are on today. As Ian, I'm also joining from the unceded territories of the Algonquin Anishinaabe. And it's quite important, especially as we talk about addressing structural inequality in an international context. We can't be doing that without acknowledging how those structural inequalities are at play on those very lands that we are having these reflections on, and the responsibility that we have beyond acknowledging. And really to answer the question on, thinking about growth that works for everyone as action area 3 of the FIAP. For me, I think it's important as we continue to see the ways in which structural inequalities and power imbalances affect the lives of so many who have less access to resources, less control over their own decision-making around those resources. It's imperative to think about growth in a way that everyone can benefit equally. And as we think about the ways in which we can promote growth for everyone, especially those who experience the most marginalization, I think it's important for us to also situate ourselves in the colonial context in which we live and have been living for centuries. When I think about that phrase, growth that works for everyone, that works for everyone, to me, that automatically implies that at one point there's been growth that doesn't work for everyone, or maybe growth that's worked for only a few. So how do we ensure we're really promoting growth for everyone? And, who is everyone? And who's currently being left out of that everyone? So I think that's where the understanding of the colonial history and the context of the structural inequalities we see today are so important. And of course, we went through a lot of that in the introduction with the Jamboard. And I think that's great. We're able to identify a lot of those groups who experience particular vulnerabilities. We know facts about the gender wage gap, low literacy rates, and low income in rural smallholder farming communities in the global south. We know that among those, women have the most restricted access to assets like land or income. And we also know of lack of opportunities for groups who face discrimination based on their race, their ethnicity, their gender identity, their sexual orientation, their class, for a number of identity factors. So it is clear who is being left out of that everyone, And when we talk about economic growth, of course, it is important to focus on initiatives that we can support in terms of economic empowerment of those groups, and such as initiatives that address women's unpaid care work, or that improve economic opportunities or promote greater financial inclusion or access to markets. But it's also important to break down the barriers and the root causes that have denied their access to economic growth historically. And for me, what that means really is emphasizing breaking down the barriers that uphold unequitable growth, and analyzing how our own self-reflection contributes to that, especially as we're trying to understand and deconstruct the colonial context in which we live. In the international cooperation sector, our work focuses so much on what we're doing, and that our main goals are to end poverty and inequality. I think it's important that we also address how we're doing that. When we talk about growth that works for everyone, we should also be committing to, reflecting on how as organizations in this sector, which is a sector that in itself is rooted in colonial history, how can we ensure that we are constantly checking ourselves and verifying our frameworks and our approaches to try to identify the biases they may carry, and really commit to an ongoing learning process to improve how we can promote growth in a way that works really for everyone. That's the gist of my perspective on that topic.
Yeah, absolutely. I think it's also misleading with the title. It says Feminist International Assistance Policy, so you automatically assume that, it's just women benefiting, but you can't really have wide economic growth without including, like you said, literally everybody within the population. So that's great. But I guess that leads pretty well into the next question, again, for both speakers. So it's just about introducing to us what the FIAP Action 3 is, what it is, what it's doing, the importance of it. I know you both sort of touched on it already at the first question, but if you could go into more detail, we'll start with Ian again.
Great, thanks. Yeah, Oxfam was one of the organizations that really advocated for the government to apply a feminist lens to its international assistance work. So before, like, the policy didn't just come into being. It was really something that took years and years of building the case, showing the policy evidence for why taking a feminist approach is going to be transformative, is going to end poverty faster, and we were one of many groups that pushed that. I think the government, there was an openness to it within government, but we really tried to push them as far as we could as they were considering, how do we want to orient the policy, what should we prioritize, and so on and so forth. So I would say it doesn't contain everything we wished for and hoped for. In that sense, it's not perfect. And I think some of I really appreciate what you just said, Rosa, about thinking about who growth is working for and who it doesn't work for. So one limitation I'd say of this kind of action area of the policy is it does focus on who growth is not working for today, but it doesn't really go after, those who are the most powerful and wealthy in our societies. It doesn't really challenge the system at a fundamental level and say that, the capitalist system is keeping women in poverty, keeping girls in poverty, keeping gender diverse people in poverty, and we need to tackle that head on. So there are limitations to it, while at the same time, we also have to look at the concept of growth and ask ourselves, is that the be-all, end-all that we really want to be promoting? Inclusive growth sounds good, and it's certainly something that you can sell widely with the Canadian public, but obviously growth has challenges, and we're starting to reach some of those ecological limits of our planet as far as having this constant focus on growth, this never-ending growth. So the Feminist International Assistance Policy was a major step forward, and it's a really positive development. It's around 6 years old now, so we've actually seen some of the evidence of what reorienting Canada's development policy in this direction can deliver, and the results have been really positive. But at the same time, it's not a perfect policy. It doesn't encompass everything necessarily that we need in order to realize gender equality. And we're always working within the politics of the possible. In this action area in particular, I think there's some really important priorities that the government sets out. And you can read a more detailed action area plan on the Global Affairs Canada website that really lays out, their priorities for this action area. So I invite you to kind of dive into it a little more deeply. But the first real priority they set is to remove the barriers to women's economic equality and women's economic empowerment. And those can be legal barriers, they can be social barriers, they can be political barriers. So really looking at to what degree are people limited in participating economically, in participating politically, in achieving more equitable economic outcomes, and what can we do through our international cooperation in order to remove those barriers, so that there is really that equal access to resources, equal control over resources, equal respect for the rights of workers regardless of their gender. And so that women workers, women entrepreneurs, and all people, regardless of their gender, really having that opportunity and equal outcome in the global economy. We've already talked about how unequal the global economy operates currently, and how many of those barriers need to be dismantled. So that was really the first priority, was to look at whether it's unpaid care work, or other infrastructure barriers that are holding back equal participation. How can we dismantle those so that we can really, unleash the potential that is already there among women and girls? I think that's really what the first priority was. The second priority really looks more at a systems level around how do we build economies that are more inclusive and more sustainable. So really looking at new economic models and ways of creating participation, opening up participation, finding ways for financial inclusion for those who are working in the informal economy. Women are heavily overrepresented in the informal sectors in the economies of most low-income and middle-income countries, which does, systematically disadvantage them in many ways. They don't enjoy the social protections that workers in the more formal economy enjoy. When economic times are hard, there's really no safety net to catch them. And we certainly saw this, and it really hit home during the COVID-19 pandemic. When the economic shocks of the pandemic hit women workers particularly hard, women entrepreneurs particularly hard, and especially those working in the informal economy that really had no safety net to fall back on. If you didn't work, if you didn't run your business, you had no livelihood, you had no income. And we saw that lockdowns and shutdowns were not an option for people who are living day to day and for whom their economic participation is actually an act of day-to-day survival. So looking at, how can we build more inclusive economies? And that includes engaging the private sector. And that's an important part of this pillar in particular, is looking at, what is the positive, constructive role that the private sector can play in creating the sustainable, inclusive economies that we need in order to achieve this growth that works for everyone. So identifying the private sector as a key partner is part of the Feminist International Assistance Policy. It's not restricted to this action area. The private sector certainly has a role to play in all the different action areas. But I think this is one where the private sector really does feel like we're at home, we know we belong here, we know we have an important role to play, and the government has been actively trying to engage them and find partnership opportunities through this action area. The third and final priority is really looking at vulnerability and resilience, and recognizing that in the current economic climate, that we will continue to face crises, we'll continue to face shocks. The COVID pandemic was one example, but there's countless, we already see the increase in climate-induced natural disasters that are hitting countries and having very, very harmful effects on livelihoods, whether it's forced displacement, whether it's losing access to resources. We can see that building up the resilience of communities and people who are the poorest and most marginalized in the global economy is going to be crucial. And so that's the third area, is looking at those fragile and conflict affected states to understand, how does women's economic equality and economic empowerment really build resilience, both for the individuals involved, but also for the societies involved. That when we see conflict erupt, when we see climate disasters strike, we know that some people are more vulnerable and will bear the brunt of those negative impacts. What through our international assistance programming can we do to really build up stronger community resilience, help those who are the most marginalized withstand these shocks and actually emerge stronger, so that actually you're not set back, but it's actually a transformative moment to build community strength and resilience. That kind of is the kind of big picture, overarching view. We can talk in a moment a little bit more about kind of the specifics of what that looks like, but I think that's really what the government was trying to achieve in laying out a little more detailed roadmap for how it was going to implement this action area.
Perfect. And then we'll have Rosa, I think, just talk about the intersection between this area and the SDGs, along with the government's commitments.
Sure, thanks so much. And thanks, Ian, for such a detailed description of really how this policy was generated. I think it's interesting to hear from Oxfam's point of view as one of the participating organizations in that process. And with regards to the intersection of the FIAP and the SDGs, I think it's clear to many of us, and we did have, we went through some of this in the Jamboard activities and linking the different performance indicators. So I think it is clear, given Canada's commitment to achieving the Sustainable Development Goals, and as Canada's Feminist International Assistance Policy, the FIAP is indeed oriented to contribute to advancing the 2023 agenda. And as I said, we looked at some of those performance indicators. And so there are performance indicators of the FIAP, and there are also performance indicators of the SDGs themselves. And in terms of the FIAP as a whole, when we're looking at all action areas, they are in line with SDGs 5 and 17. So SDG 5, of course, being gender equality, is the guiding goal for the FIAP. And it relates to the percentage of international assistance that either targets or integrates gender equality and the empowerment of women and girls. And SDG 17 really refers to strengthening global partnerships for sustainable development. So it's about the number of organizations that support and develop and implement this programming. So us as Canadian organizations are very relevant to that part of the SDGs in terms of FIAP's action areas. When we look at growth that looks for everyone, in particular as FIAP's action area number 3, there are a number of SDGs that are linked to those performance indicators. So we're talking about SDG 1, ending poverty in all its forms everywhere. SDG 2, of course, ending hunger and achieving food security, as we know that women and girls are highly affected by those issues. SDG 8, of course, which directly relates to growth as it's sustainable economic and inclusive growth and employment and decent work for all, as well as SDG number 9, which relates to building resilient infrastructure. Of course, when we're talking about economic growth, there will be infrastructure involved. So there's a need to promote inclusive and sustainable industrialization. So I think a lot of the indicators, both of the FIAP and the SDGs, they do intersect. And another element that I think is particularly important to mention, especially as part of the organization that I'm representing as the Cooperative Development Foundation of Canada and as part of the international cooperative movement, is that the United Nations and the international community has also officially recognized the important role of cooperatives as vehicles for achieving the Sustainable Development Goals. And this is due to the nature of cooperatives themselves, which are member-owned and member-run entities that really exist all over the world and have existed for a long time. There is an important link between the cooperative approach and the approaches to achieve the SDGs and goals of policies like the FIAP. So I can talk a bit more about the cooperative approach later on as I describe our work at CDF Canada. But it's important to recognize that there have been conversations that have taken place during the recent evaluations of the SDG progress. This year marked the midterm review year for the SDGs, and there have been the country level review labs that are part of the United Nations high-level political forums that have highlighted the key role of cooperatives in helping nations progress towards achieving the SDGs. So I can elaborate a little more in the further questions on that topic on cooperatives as well.
Yeah, that's perfect. Actually, that's great segue again into the third question. So we'll actually start with Rosa this time, but we're just going to be talking specifically about what CDF Canada and Oxfam are doing in order to promote and advance this action area. So Rosa, can you talk a little bit more about cooperatives, especially with CDF Canada, in implementing action area number 3?
Yeah, of course. Yeah, since I was just on that topic, it'd be great to just continue. So I can start by just introducing CDF Canada as an organization. CDF Canada has been working for over 75 years now, and we are the international development arm of the Canadian cooperative and credit union sector. So the main pillar of CDF's work is partnering with cooperatives. And as a quick definition, a cooperative is a group of people who get together based on a common need and a common interest, and they form an autonomous association to voluntarily meet their own economic, social, and cultural needs. So they form a jointly owned and democratically controlled enterprise. So co-ops are really, they're run by their members and they're owned by their members. And all members are shareholders of a co-op, and all members vote in the co-op's decision-making process. So as these are like businesses that are first off driven by their common values and interests, they're not driven not just by profit, it is part of it, but they're part of the avenues to working together to create sustainable growth that can really meet the needs of communities and generate long-term prosperity. And as an organization, our work at CDF leverages the cooperative model as the main pillar to our approach. So we utilize an approach called the integrated co-op model in most of our work, which is a 3-part approach that it links production with access to finance and market access through the co-op business model. So we support cooperatives first in strengthening their capacities in different areas like governance and management, really how they can strengthen their services that they provide to members, whether those services be loans or agricultural inputs or access to shared farming equipment, or we'll support them on how they can expand their membership and enhance the inclusivity of their services. Like, for example, how to ensure that women can access loans or financial services, as we know that they're not as often as accessible to women because of the higher borrowing costs, or because women are less likely to be formally employed. They have lower credit ratings, so they can't access loans as easily. And so in addition to supporting cooperatives directly, CDF also works with communities and supports them to utilize cooperatives as vehicles to gain access to markets and financial services that can help them contribute to inclusive economic growth. So we really have a diversity of projects that are all based on the cooperative model. We do have projects that focus on food security, on gender equality, on working for climate change adaptation. And of course, all our work includes a strong gender equality component where the main focus is on women and groups who experience higher levels of vulnerability. So as we work with the co-ops to strengthen their ability to function inclusively, we also work to directly support women's economic empowerment through initiatives for women entrepreneurs that can offer business training, financial literacy training, leadership, or marketing training. So of course, the projects that we're currently supporting are funded by Global Affairs Canada, and they aim to support the action areas of the FIAP, especially Action Area 3, as growth that works for everyone, given our emphasis on cooperatives and access to finance. So one example I can talk about today is a program called Voice for Women and Girls, which is a volunteer cooperation program, and it is funded by Global Affairs Canada. And so the Voice for Women and Girls partners with local co-ops and credit unions in 4 African countries, in Ethiopia, Ghana, Kenya, and Malawi. And there's a focus on supporting women-led cooperatives and women-led organizations. And our key performance indicators for Voice are linked to, of course, SDGs 2, 5, and 9 as part of the FIAP's key performance indicators that we report on. And as the Voice program supports growth that works for everyone, of course, we're focusing on those who experience the most marginalization. And this is done through a training of trainers approach. So there is really an effort to be intentional about who is included in the pool of trainers. And every cooperative in the program identifies the communities that they themselves define as more exposed to vulnerability. And this is a process that women-led partner cooperatives and credit unions lead in deciding how they can best strengthen their ability to support inclusive growth. In some cases, that focus may be one that the co-ops didn't necessarily use before. And part of the Voice program is to accompany them in that process. And sometimes that involves focusing on the co-op membership. In others, it involves focusing on services that are offered by the cooperative, or ensuring that the more marginalized members can benefit from the co-op just as much as any other member. Sometimes it involves specific capacity building to women entrepreneurs. So one example of a specific initiative in the Voice program is the example of Malawi, where we've worked with 12 cooperatives across Malawi to train the women members in producing and marketing reusable sanitary menstruation pads. And it's an initiative that's really demonstrated multiple layers of benefit for women and girls. There's some of the 12 Malawian co-ops, like for example, there's a co-op that's called Mikoko Co-op. They're a cooperative of rice farmers, and they were able to provide sewing machines and training to their women members. And in the first year, the cooperatives produced enough sanitary pads to sell a portion of them for additional income generation. And they also donated another portion to schools in their communities. So in addition to strengthening the women co-op members' skills around entrepreneurship and marketing, they're also diversifying their sources of income generation. And it's an initiative that also helped respond to community needs by supporting young girls to attend school more often, who otherwise would not afford reusable sanitary pads or any at all. So there has been important awareness raising and sensitization as part of this initiative to really destigmatize harmful beliefs around girls' menstruation, which helps them stay in school and increase their access to future employment. And of course, the sensitization piece also involves engaging men and boys to support women's economic empowerment so that they can continue to excel as entrepreneurs and not encounter the same barriers time and time again. And so I like this example because as the income generation is developed through the cooperative model, many of the 12 Malawian cooperatives, they've leveraged their initial profits to upscale and build on their collective businesses. So for example, the Mikoko Co-op, they signed an agreement with their local health center to deliver a supply of these reusable pads. And they've also really improved their governance as part of this initiative. So the Mikoko Co-op, they were able to elect more women on their boards of directors. And because of that, they were invited to present in the capital during the International Day of Co-ops. So that allowed them to share their innovation of reusable sanitary pads along with their rice products, which is their main reason for existing as a cooperative, and that allowed them to make linkages with potential buyers and have higher participation in the value chain. And there are some other co-ops in the initiative that have been purchasing more sewing machines and expanding to produce other clothing items like school uniforms, skirts, or dresses. So that's one example. There's a number of other initiatives through the Voice program where cooperatives themselves identify which needs they think are best to address and how they can do so through promoting women's economic empowerment and the empowerment of those who they consider marginalized, and how they can really involve them in the cooperative's activities. Yeah, that's kind of an example and an overview of how we work, and there are many more, but I'll leave it at that for now.
Yeah, that's great. Thank you so much for sharing. That sounds like a really great initiative. And then now we'll just hear from Ian on the Oxfam side, I guess a little bit of a different perspective, but go ahead, Ian.
Great. Thanks, Anya. And Rosa, I didn't realize your organization was 75 years old. That's quite something. We are celebrating our 60th anniversary as Oxfam Canada this year. So old, but not quite up there. And we have another
Congrats.
Oxfam. What's that?
Congrats.
Yeah, we just had a party a few weeks ago. So it's nice to celebrate these milestones. We also have a sister agency, Oxfam Quebec, that operates in Canada as well. So I just kind of wanted to give a shout out to them for folks who are interested in getting involved in Oxfam Canada. Encourage you to visit our website, but also for anyone in Quebec, please do reach out to Oxfam Quebec and learn a bit more about their programs. They obviously do similar feminist programming as Oxfam Canada, but have a slightly different focus and different way of working. We decided over 15 years ago to reorient all of Oxfam Canada's programming towards gender justice and women's rights. So we made this commitment long before the Feminist International Assistance Policy was on the map, and certainly long before it was official government policy. So this is an orientation that we as an organization have taken for some time, and we really made that move. I wasn't working at Oxfam at the time, but those who made the decision really felt that centering women's rights and gender equality was going to be a winning strategy to ending poverty. And I think through kind of proving that model was helpful in bringing the government to reorient Canada's international assistance in that direction as well. We were also pointing out the fact that other donor countries weren't prioritizing this in the same way, and we wouldn't achieve gender equality unless the countries that really believed in gender equality stepped up and resourced women's rights movements and feminist movements in low-income and middle-income countries. So that was kind of our pitch, was that if you actually give resources to women's rights movements and feminist organizations, they will run with it and they will totally show you what transformative change looks like. And so we were doing it in our programming before it became a Government of Canada directive across the board, but we're very pleased to see them join us on this journey. And then there's other donor governments that have also brought a feminist lens to their international assistance, and in some cases to their whole foreign policy. So it goes beyond just the aid programs, but really looking at, you know, how they engage in peace and security work, how they engage in diplomacy. They take a feminist approach across the board. So that's, you know, really promising to see countries applying this more widely in their foreign policy. I wanted to give a few examples from Oxfam's programming just about how we work on women's economic empowerment and equality as Oxfam Canada, who we partner with. I was really interested to hear the example you were providing, Rosa, in a multi-country project like that. I'm sure there's like umpteen stories you could tell, actually. And I wanted to share a link.
I think you're muted, Ian.
Yeah, I think.
Must
Did
have
I
slipped
mute
on
as
the
I
mute
hit?
button.
Oh, okay. Here, I shared the link and I muted myself at the same time. So yeah, just not that you need to go into it now, but it just kind of describes how some of the concepts that we were discussing in the JAM board, how we as Oxfam Canada understand them as barriers and how we are working to dismantle them. So that just gives you a bit, for those who like the sort of big picture overview, welcome you to dive into that document. It's not very long, but it kind of gives you a nice overview of our approach to women's economic empowerment, and shows some of the principles, some of those feminist principles we're trying to apply as we work with partners to build these projects, to work with them to ask, like, what do you need in your context? What should we be prioritizing? And how can we build a project with you that will really have lasting change? I wanted to provide 3 quick examples from the work of Oxfam Canada. 2 of them are financed under the Feminist International Assistance Project, and the third one isn't. And I just wanted to include it because I think it's also interesting to talk about some of the women's economic equality work that goes on in our sector that isn't necessarily funded from Government of Canada sources. Some of our organizations fundraise from the Canadian public. So we have, you know, individual supporters who contribute to our feminist programming as well. And we also get, resources from a variety of different sources. So it's not only about Global Affairs Canada, but the first 2 examples I did want to share are Global Affairs Canada supported projects. The first one is in Bangladesh, and it's called Securing Rights. And it works with domestic workers who are some of the most precariously employed workers in Bangladesh, because they work in people's homes and they're out of sight, and often have a relationship with a family or a particular household that isn't really regulated or isn't part of an industry, so to speak. And so the working conditions that they work under and their access to rights are really limited. And a few years ago, the government of Bangladesh actually passed a new law to better protect the rights of domestic workers, because they recognize the vulnerability under which they worked. The vast majority are women workers in the context of Bangladesh. And although the law was a progressive step forward, we recognized that actually putting a change on paper wasn't actually going to change the women workers' access to rights or their relationship with their employers just by passing a law. That at the heart of the project was really, how do we take this progressive piece of legislation and make it a reality so that women workers can defend their rights. The first step, of course, is understanding your rights. So at the heart of the project is really about training and capacity strengthening so that the women workers who are working as domestic workers in Dhaka understand what their labor rights are, what the protections are under the law, but also the households within which they're working, that they also understand their roles and responsibilities as employers. That's a really, fundamental part of kind of changing the dynamic and the power balance between the workers and the employers in this sector. We also worked with a private sector partner to look at an electronic platform where workers could find jobs in the domestic work sector, and employers could find workers, so bringing together the workers and the employers, but also building in accountability mechanisms so that if you do experience worker rights violations with an employer that you were matched with through this online platform, that there would be a reporting mechanism, and that would enhance accountability. So there's a convenience factor for the households to be able to have a pool of domestic workers that they gain access to through the project. But the flip side is that by entering into this more systematic way of matching together labor and employers, that we can build in accountability mechanisms, and we can also access this pool of workers for the training programs so that they have a better understanding of their rights. So we're about halfway into the life of the project, and it's been going extremely well. We've trained hundreds of domestic workers on their rights. We have over 1,000 workers participating in the online platform, and really seeing a substantial difference in how workers are understanding their rights in this context. So that was a really an important one. I noticed Bangladesh was one of the countries that you had in your top 5 list. So we're one of the NGOs that was involved in that one, and working with partners in Bangladesh who have longstanding relationships with domestic worker organizations. So that's really been a part of the Oxfam model, as well as kind of Rosa was mentioning, as well as kind of working in partnership with local civil society, and in the case of securing rights, also a local private sector partner was part of the project. The second example I wanted to share is a project that we're running with partners in Guatemala, and in a very remote rural part of Guatemala called Alta Verapaz. We're working with, in Alta Verapaz, the majority of the population is indigenous. So most of the communities are predominantly indigenous, and the poverty rate is around 80%. So the vast majority of people are living in poverty and identify as indigenous. Our project is called Camino Verde, and which means the green path or the green way. And Camino Verde is really working with our indigenous partner organizations in Alta Verapaz to look at what are sustainable economic alternatives to some of the mega projects and the plantations that are very active in this part of Guatemala. Part of the process is actually resourcing indigenous communities to regain their indigenous knowledge systems and their indigenous agricultural practices on the land, so that there's a dimension of both economic empowerment, but also sustainability, sustainable farming, agroecology, that is really key to the project. The other element of the project is an advocacy school. So the women's organizations that are leading some of these sustainable agriculture projects will also have participants participate in an advocacy school where there's capacity strengthening on your rights and how to defend your rights, so that you're not only being empowered as economic actors, but you're also able to participate more fully in the political process of your community, your region, your country. As most of you know, I mean, Indigenous peoples face numerous barriers to political participation and self-determination in countless countries, and the inequality is huge in Guatemala. I mean, it's a vast majority of the population that are just excluded from the decision making of the central government. So the advocacy school, in addition to having the economic empowerment activities of the project, really does open up avenues to kind of sustain the gains that they make through these projects over the longer term, so that they are better empowered to engage in political processes in Guatemala, to defend their rights, to sustain the wins and the victories that they've made through their sustainable agriculture projects. The third and final example I wanted to provide, like I said, is not funded by Global Affairs Canada. It's actually a solidarity campaign that we launched 2 years ago with the women who make our clothes, and it's called What She Makes. It's looking at how much do the women who sew our clothes earn for their labor, and what are the inequalities in the global fashion industry. So in the countries that we're focusing on this year are Bangladesh and Cambodia. And you'll see that the disparity between what you get paid as a fashion industry CEO and what you get paid as a worker who's actually sewing on the line and actually producing the garments that the CEO's company is ultimately paying are just enormous. And it's just a really clear example of those inequalities that exist in the global economy, and that we as Canadians can do something to change. So the What She Makes campaign really targets 5 Canadian fashion brands and says, we want you as a brand to commit to pay the workers who make your products a living wage. We want you to come up with a public plan that you share with the public about how you're going to get there. And we want to see step by step how you're going to achieve living wages for the women who make your clothes and whose products you're selling in Canadian stores every day. So the campaign, again, it's not a Government of Canada campaign, but I think it's very much in line with the sort of change and the sort of principles that we're talking about under this action area of the FIAP. So I did want to bring it up. And the other beauty is, if you go on our whatshemakes.ca website, you can take action today. We have Aritzia is actually our brand that we're targeting at the moment. So if you'd like to go on our website and send a message to the CEO of Aritzia, we've detailed that a worker in Cambodia would have to work over 1,000 days to earn what the CEO earns in one day. So just to kind of highlight, what the disparity is, and that profitable Canadian companies can change their practices so that they pay their workers who make their products a living wage. So that's our call through this campaign, and it's looking at many of the same issues, but again, it's not through a government-funded project, but really at the heart of it, it's informed by those same principles of working in partnership, supporting women who are marginalized to defend their rights, and really pushing for systems change. So we're not just kind of tinkering around the edges or making a few cosmetic changes, but really going to the root of what is keeping people in poverty and trying to change those systems. So thank you.
Thank you. That last point is super interesting to me as well, because I've always been fascinated by consumerism and consumer behavior change. I feel that's like one big part of sort of making this change happen, because a lot of the times, it's hard for people who are almost removed from the problem at hand to understand the disparity to such like a detailed extent. So I don't know, I'm always interested in sort of those educational campaigns that really highlight those differences. And just before we go to the last question, I just wanted to highlight the chat. So Madhuri has asked about the platform that you were talking about earlier, because she is also Bangladeshi and had thought about having an app that connected domestic workers with employers. So that's super interesting as well. And then, yeah, I think, and she was also mentioning that What She Makes campaign is just great. And she's been seeing a lot of the advocacy messages from that lately. So super, super great work happening there. And then, so our last question is just about sort of some of the opportunities for collaboration and challenges that come with being civil society partners, especially that are working in this area. So we'll start with Ian and then Rosa, and we'll wrap up with a quick Q&A. But Ian, go ahead, take it away.
Sure, I'll be brief. I just wanted to say one challenge that comes to mind under this action area is how we define the private sector and how we partner with actors in the private sector. I think it's been a challenge for Canadian NGOs to figure out, and getting back to the point that there's no one size fits all approach to how this feminist programming is done. The private sector includes small enterprises, women entrepreneur-led enterprises are part of the private sector. So are enormous multinational corporations and everything in between. And all of those entities have a role to play in advancing gender equality and changing the kind of economy that we have so it becomes more inclusive. But how we partner with them, who we partner with, what that change looks like, depends a lot on who holds power, what the context is in the country where you're working, and the kind of feminist principles that your organization wants to apply to the projects that you're developing. So sometimes you'll work with a women's rights partner organization that has a real appetite and willingness to partner with the private sector. In other cases, there's a real reluctance to do so, and a real mistrust that can develop. So navigating some of those dynamics, I think, is one of the challenges of implementing this action area. There's no one right answer. You have to work with your partners on developing activities and initiatives that work in their context, that are true to your values and theirs, where you can really find that alignment. But recognizing that there is a role for the private sector to play in inclusive growth, I think, is something that the FIAP does presuppose, and it's our work to kind of figure out what that looks like in practice.
Perfect. And then say question to you, Rosa.
Is it over to me? Okay, great. Yeah, just to reiterate, Ian, it was so great to hear about your examples. I really liked the last one on the What She Makes campaign. So I wanted to echo the others' voices as well. I think, and talking about the relationship that civil society can have with the private sector is really important. That there's a lot to be learned. So Oxfam has some great examples on how you are pushing advocacy. It doesn't have to be exclusively through government-funded initiatives. It can be through a number of different ways to go about that. So I think from CDF's experience, if we're looking at opportunities and challenges, I think a lot of the opportunities, first off, they lie in partnering with different organizations in civil society and really sharing our experiences and building collectively on what we all know and what we've all learned and can offer. One really quick example of knowledge sharing that is facilitated by CDF Canada is called the Women's Mentorship Program. And it is part of our initiatives funded by Global Affairs as well, but I wanted to mention it because it's an opportunity that is for women managers in the savings and credit union sector across the globe to share experiences and take part in a tailored training program for their own professional development. So every 2 years, CDF Canada invites a cohort of women managers from credit unions and cooperatives across different countries in Africa, Asia, and the Americas. And the cohort of women come to Canada, and each woman manager is paired with a Canadian credit union where they take part in a placement that includes knowledge exchange with general managers and branch managers. And then the participants also have a chance to share their skills from their own countries with their Canadian counterparts and within the group. It's a really inspiring program because as in all sectors, We know that women have less access to leadership positions, and that is the case in the cooperative and credit union sector as well. And to date, CDF has had a number of women from 19 countries across the globe over the years. I had the pleasure of meeting some of the participants in last year's cohort, and I got to hear about the different challenges and lessons learned from women managers in credit unions here in Canada, in the Philippines, in Kenya, in a number of other countries. So I think there are a lot of opportunities in working together as civil society organizations towards inclusive growth. That said, of course, the opportunities, they always do come with challenges, and there are ways that we can address them. I think sometimes working with civil society, sometimes it is challenging to coordinate our efforts. So especially when we're looking to develop new projects, we don't always know what other organizations are doing. Sometimes it can be challenging to cover everything that has been learned in past projects, which is why it's really important to engage at the country level. If we're going to work in a specific area or a specific sector, we have to see what are the complementary areas of civil society actors, what are they doing, what have they done in the past. When we're planning an initiative, there can also be other organizations doing the same thing. So we want to ensure that we're building on what's already there and what expertise do the partners and co-ops have to really ensure we're not duplicating our efforts and how they can be complementary. Because there's always connections within the sectors, you know, even with the humanitarian sector and the sector that we work in. Those who work towards inclusive healthcare connect with education, and that connects with economic well-being. So we can't really work in silos. We do need to ensure that coordination happens. So, you know, spaces like this are great because we're able to learn about what other NGOs are doing. What is Oxfam doing? I think that is a proactive way of overcoming this challenge. And I think also sometimes it can also be challenging when we partner with organizations in civil society. They themselves can also be working with other donors. So that can sometimes mean that their capacities to respond to reporting needs are limited. And it is important for us to be sensitive to those needs. So I think that goes back to how we began this discussion in the first place, relating to the importance of how we as organizations are working, how we work, not what we do. And it's important and it is challenging, really taking the time to self-reflect on like, how do we work with our partners? And even internally, how do we work as Canadian organizations? You know, not just what are the tools we use, but how do we use them? How do we approach it? How are our frameworks making things easier or maybe more challenging for our partners? And especially as we remind ourselves that we're trying to understand and deconstruct the colonial context in which we live and work, there are things to keep in mind to overcome.
For sure. Thank you so much. That sort of wraps up the formal question period that we had. And I'll just jump to the audience to see if anybody has a question for either of our speakers. I think Kezia.
I know you guys spoke briefly about the projects that you guys are working on, but as youth, we were wanting to see what, in which ways that we could contribute towards the implementation of FIAP's action area, specifically in your organization.
Okay, I can go ahead right away, and then maybe Ian can complement for Oxfam. Specifically for CDF Canada, the program that I was describing earlier, Voice for Women and Girls, is a volunteer cooperation program. So youth can contribute by volunteering with CDF Canada directly. We are currently recruiting volunteers of all ages. And this is a program, as I mentioned, that partners with the local cooperatives and credit unions in the 4 countries, so Ethiopia, Kenya, Malawi, and Ghana. We're looking for volunteers to support different roles, capacity building, different areas of expertise, like even gender equality or environmental sustainability. There can be other more specific technical areas like financial literacy or governance, but it's not limited to those. It can be quite broad. So if you are looking for an opportunity to take part in initiatives that can support organizations in this sector, you can check out some of our placements that are available at the moment. That is one way that youth can directly contribute, and it would be a great help.
Thank you.
Maybe from the Oxfam side, I'll just say that like participating in our campaigns like the What She Makes campaign is like a crucial way that you can really amplify the voices of the women workers that we're working with, and put the pressure on the Canadian companies that are really the focus of the campaign. It's a multi-year campaign. We're not going to get living wages overnight, but the pressure is building, and we are starting to see those changes within the companies as they make new commitments and strengthen the kind of standards that they apply to their supplier factories. But they really care what the Canadian public thinks about them. Like, reputation is huge in the fashion industry, and particularly people in your demographic, like the younger generation of citizens and consumers. They're very vulnerable to, and they're very concerned about. So you actually have quite a bit of power when you raise your voices together. The other thing, we create opportunities for supporters of Oxfam Canada to meet our partners. So there are, webinars or online opportunities to talk directly to some of the partners with whom we're implementing these projects. So if you join our social media feeds or our e-newsletters, you can find out about these opportunities to engage directly with some of the partners that we work with on these projects, and learn more about upcoming projects that I haven't even mentioned yet, but that are just kind of coming into implementation stage right now. The last thing I'd say is that even though Global Affairs Canada funds most of the project, we still have to find matching funds to actually fund the rest. So they'll fund like up to 80% of the project or 90%, but then we still need to fundraise from the Canadian public to actually have the project be fully funded and implemented. So there's lots of opportunities actually to kind of profile the work of our partners and actually to engage in our fundraising activities so that the projects being implemented under this action area, we actually have the resources to pull them off. It's not that we get everything we need from Global Affairs Canada. There's often a need to continue to fundraise, and we like to fundraise in a way that really educates and engages Canadians in the work that we're doing, and also makes connections to issues at home. It's not like we don't have care workers and domestic workers who are precariously working and underpaid in Canada. So drawing the links to some of the issues that we work on in our projects to the issues that we're facing in our own communities is another really important part of our work at Oxfam. And we do create opportunities for folks, whether it's looking at the Indigenous empowerment of Camino Verde, how are we actually working with host nations in Canada on whose territories we live and work every day, and how can we build up stronger relationships with those host nations. These are some of the other things that I think people can do that are not directly supporting the project, but are kind of connecting the dots around the issues that these projects are really fundamentally working on. We can involve young people in the work that we do internationally, but we're also very excited about mobilizing around these same gender justice issues at home.
Thank you. And just in the interest of time, I'm not sure if you'll be able to answer this last question from Ray, but it was just in response to you mentioning that growth is not everything. So Ray was just wondering what other focuses you personally would like to see, or Oxfam would like to see besides growth. But I guess you sort of answered that with the last bit of your answer to the previous question. And then same thing for Rosa, just from your personal perspective as well, or from the point of view of CDF Canada, what other aspects you'd like to see besides growth. So I think we could take like the last maybe 2 minutes just to answer that quickly, and then we'll pass it to Raja to do just the closing remarks.
Great. I'll jump in quickly just to say, like I was alluding to, I think Indigenous partner organizations already pointing us to worldviews and understandings that go far beyond economic growth. It's really valuing life that is the priority, and really recentering our economic activities so we are centered around life is key. And I think there's a lot of feminist economists that have been saying this for decades and decades as well. So there's lots to draw from, whether it's from Indigenous traditions or feminist thought, to really unpack the limits of growth. So thanks, that was a great question.
Yeah, I agree. And I think, Ian, your answer really, it's a good foundation, and I think it relates a lot to the approach that we work with, which is the cooperative approach. So when you're saying life-centered, it's also, you know, people-centered. So when we're looking at progress that is based on value before profit, I think those are some of the things that I would like to see personally, and CDF as an organization stands by. So not growth just for the sake of growth, but you know, for needs that are identified and that can be returned to those who are the holders of progress. And that does relate a lot to what Ian is saying of a lot of the Indigenous cosmovisions that are so rich in their knowledge, and we only know so little about. I think unpacking those and really giving the value that they deserve can allow us to expand our perception and realize that growth isn't linear, and it's not exponential either. It means so much more than monetary value. So yeah, thanks for your your input as well, Ian.
Thank you both. I think we'll wrap up there. We're already over time, but I'll send it over to Raja just to close this session up.
Thank you so much, Sonia. Thank you so much to Ian and Rosa for your insights and expertise. It's honestly been such an honor and pleasure to learn from you today. I will, and I'm sure that our participants will continue to reflect on today's discussion. I'd like to thank YPH members Leanne, Kezia, Ray, Sonia, and then the OCIC team, Pragya, Helena, and Sagarika, for all their efforts in making the session a success today. With this, I would like to formally conclude today's session and invite you all to stay tuned to our social media for the upcoming events. The dates and timings of upcoming Policy Matters series are in the chat. And thank you so much for joining us. I hope you have a great evening, and we look forward to seeing you again soon. Bye, everyone.
Bye, thank you.
Thank you so much.
Thank you. Bye-bye.
Thank you.